Never tell people what you do. Introduction. In the introduction of Never Tell People What You Do, J.J. McCorvey challenges the modern obsession with self-definition and constant sharing by presenting a compelling argument for embracing strategic ambiguity in our personal and professional lives. In a culture dominated by social media, networking events, and personal branding, where everyone is encouraged to define themselves in terms of their work, their titles, their accomplishments, or their side hustles, McCorvey proposes a radical alternative. Don't tell people what you do, not because you have something to hide, but because what you don't say can be more powerful than what you do. He opens by highlighting how the urge to constantly introduce ourselves by our professions, I'm a designer, I'm a founder, I'm a consultant, places us into easily digestible categories that flatten the complexity of our identities and reduce our social power. When we lead with what we do, we give others immediate access to assumptions, biases, expectations, and limitations that might not serve our long-term goals. By revealing too much too soon, we surrender an element of control in how we are perceived. The author likens it to playing poker with your cards face up. Once people think they know your value, they adjust their behavior accordingly, sometimes to exploit, diminish, or overlook you. McCorvey draws from psychology, history, and personal experience to show that mystique has always been a subtle yet commanding form of influence. He points out that the people who are remembered, respected, or even feared often give the least away about themselves up front. Think of cultural icons, leaders, or innovators who are known more for the impact of their work than for self-descriptions or online bios. The introduction encourages the reader to shift from a mindset of overexposure to one of intentional understatement. This doesn't mean becoming evasive or dishonest. It means choosing your moments of disclosure carefully and realizing that you don't owe the world your resume in every conversation. In fact, withholding can spark curiosity, deepen engagement, and open more meaningful connections because people are drawn to what they don't fully understand. This strategic ambiguity also creates space. Space for growth, for reinvention, for confidence that isn't dependent on constant external validation. McCorvey contrasts this with the exhausting performance of personal branding, where people become trapped in the very labels they think will empower them. Once you define yourself too clearly, he argues, you limit your freedom to evolve or to surprise others. The introduction also explores how much of our tendency to explain ourselves is rooted in insecurity, the fear that if we don't state our value up front, we'll be dismissed or forgotten. But the book urges a shift in mindset. What if your value is assumed rather than announced? What if the quiet confidence of saying less actually amplifies your presence? McCorvey suggests that in many high-stakes environments, corporate, creative, or social, the person who maintains mystery often commands the room. The introduction sets the tone for a book that's not about manipulation, but about reclaiming the power of intentional silence in a noisy world. It asks the reader to consider what might happen if they stopped answering the question, "So what do you do?" with the usual scripts and started letting their actions, demeanor, and presence speak instead. By turning away from the need to constantly define and perform who we are, McCorvey invites readers into a mindset of subtlety, sovereignty, and psychological strength. The opening chapter makes it clear. This is not just a book about communication strategy, it's about rethinking how we exist in public and how much of ourselves we choose to make legible to others. Through this lens, silence becomes a strategy, mystery becomes magnetism, and the refusal to define oneself becomes an act of personal power. Chapter 1, The Power of Mystery, sets the foundational philosophy for the rest of the book by arguing that mystery is not only a social advantage but also a form of power in itself, one that is increasingly rare and valuable in a hyperconnected world where overexposure is the norm. J.J. McCorvey begins by challenging the assumption that visibility and transparency always lead to influence. Instead, he proposes that mystery, the deliberate withholding of information, creates a compelling presence that invites curiosity, attention, and even reverence. He references how mysterious figures in history and pop culture, from political leaders to artists to spiritual gurus, have commanded immense influence, often by being careful about what they reveal and what they don't. The idea is that mystery disrupts expectations. It interrupts the usual scripts of social interaction by introducing uncertainty, and in that uncertainty, people become more attentive, more interested, more respectful, or even more cautious around you. This is where McCorvey introduces the concept of informational scarcity. When you say less about who you are and what you do, every detail you do reveal becomes more valuable. He contrasts this with the modern tendency to share everything, on social media, in networking events, and in casual conversation, which he argues devalues our narrative and turns us into background noise in a world already saturated with noise. The power of mystery, then, is in its ability to create contrast, to slow down perception, and to make people lean in rather than scroll past. McCorvey supports his point with psychological insights, explaining that human beings are naturally curious about gaps in knowledge, and when someone presents themselves as a puzzle rather than a product, others instinctively want to solve that puzzle, which leads to deeper interest and stronger impressions. He goes on to explain that when you're too obvious, people place you into predefined categories that often come with their own baggage, bias, judgment, assumptions, none of which may reflect your true value. On the other hand, when you remain undefined, you allow others to project value onto you, often higher than what you might have stated outright. The chapter includes anecdotes of individuals who rose to prominence not through loud self-promotion, but through quiet confidence and consistent action. For example, McCorvey may reference how some leaders in business or creative industries became magnetic figures not because they were constantly marketing themselves, but because they cultivated an aura of self-possession, mystery, and restraint, releasing information only when it mattered and only to the right people. The power of mystery is also tied to protection. McCorvey warns that the more people know about you, your goals, your plans, your insecurities, the more ammunition they have to undermine, manipulate, or compete with you. In a world that thrives on comparison and quiet envy, mystery acts as armor. When you withhold details about your professional pursuits, your ambitions, or even your strategies, you reduce the opportunities for others to interfere with them. This protection is especially important in environments where success invites competition or sabotage. Mystery creates a psychological boundary, a sense that you're not fully accessible, and that inaccessibility is often interpreted as strength. Furthermore, McCorvey addresses how mystery can be a source of internal strength, not just a social tactic. When you stop defining yourself through constant disclosure, you begin to develop a deeper sense of self that is less dependent on external approval or recognition. It becomes easier to focus, to think clearly, to act deliberately because you're not performing for an audience, you're moving in silence. He writes about how powerful it can be to carry plans and visions in your heart without the need to announce them. This allows ideas to mature without interruption, and goals to evolve without being constrained by others' expectations. McCorvey draws a strong line between secrecy and mystery. Secrecy hides weakness, mystery reveals strength. Secrecy comes from fear, but mystery comes from confidence. Confidence that you don't need to explain yourself to be taken seriously. He encourages the reader to adopt small daily practices that cultivate mystery, such as resisting the urge to overshare in conversations, declining to answer questions that feel too invasive, or simply redirecting attention from what you do to how you think. By focusing on presence rather than performance, you become someone who people feel, but can't quite place, and that energy is magnetic. The chapter concludes by emphasizing that in a world where everyone is busy telling you what they do, what they've achieved, and what they're building, the person who doesn't say much, but carries themselves with clarity, intention, and groundedness, immediately stands out. That is the power of mystery. It turns the act of holding back into a display of strength, and transforms your silence into something people notice, respect, and often admire. It's not about being evasive but about being deliberate. In Mastering the Art of Mystery, McCorvey argues, you reclaim your narrative, protect your energy, and position yourself to move more freely and more powerfully in the world. Chapter 2: Overexposure Kills Influence. J.J. McCorvey explores the idea that constantly putting ourselves on display, sharing every thought, update, and achievement, dilutes our impact and undermines the very influence we're trying to build. In a world where visibility is often mistaken for success and relevance, McCorvey pushes back against the cultural pressure to constantly narrate our lives, especially our work. He begins by pointing out how social media platforms, networking norms, and personal branding ideologies have made it feel almost mandatory to showcase what we're doing, building, or striving for, essentially turning our lives into a performance for public consumption. While this exposure may seem empowering on the surface, McCorvey argues that it creates diminishing returns. The more people know about you, the less they value that knowledge, and the more they begin to take your presence, and your effort, for granted. This overexposure, he explains, makes people predictable, which in turn makes them easier to ignore or overlook. Once people feel like they've figured you out, your intrigue fades and so does your leverage. In this chapter, McCorvey makes a strong case that mystery is not just a personality trait, but a social currency, and overexposure is the inflation that devalues it. He illustrates this with examples of public figures who initially captivated audiences through mystery and restraint but lost their influence once they became overexposed through oversharing, overtalking, or overpromoting themselves. The underlying idea is that influence is tied to perception, and perception is shaped by scarcity, When your thoughts, presence, or work are rare or exclusive, people pay closer attention and assign more meaning to what they see. McCorvey draws on psychology and behavioral science to show that humans are wired to respond more intensely to what is scarce or limited, and when you remove the element of scarcity through constant exposure, you erode the perception of value. This principle, he notes, applies to personal relationships, business negotiations, social dynamics, and even leadership. People naturally admire and respect what they can't easily access or fully understand. But when you give too much of yourself, too much of your story, your strategy, your energy, you begin to seem ordinary, even desperate for validation. And desperation, McCorvey emphasizes, is the opposite of influence. He warns against the false sense of connection that oversharing often creates. While it may feel like you're building relationships or brand loyalty, in many cases you're training people to tune you out. Attention is not just something to win, it must be preserved and managed, and overexposure does the opposite. The chapter critiques the modern trend of document everything advice, often given to entrepreneurs and creatives, where every part of the process is shared in the name of transparency. McCorvey argues that this level of visibility weakens the impact of the final product, because the mystery and anticipation are gone. He encourages readers to practice strategic invisibility, not by becoming reclusive or withholding without purpose, but by being intentional about what they share, when they share it, and why. Not every meeting needs to be posted, not every win needs to be announced, and not every insight needs to be tweeted. Sometimes the most powerful move is to stay quiet and let the results speak louder than any caption could. He shares how some of the most effective and respected individuals in any field are those who allow their reputations to grow organically, in whispers rather than billboards. Their work travels ahead of them. Their presence is not announced, it is felt. McCorvey also discusses the internal consequences of overexposure, the psychological toll it takes to maintain a curated persona, the anxiety of always being on, and the way it fragments your focus and authenticity. When you're constantly thinking about how to package your life for others, you stop living it fully. You become more performer than participant, more broadcaster than builder. And over time, that drains the clarity, depth, and originality that real influence requires. He cautions readers to be aware of the trade-off between visibility and vitality. Every time you share something publicly, you give away a piece of your energy, your privacy, your strategy. And once it's out, you can't control how it's interpreted, used, or misunderstood. This loss of control weakens your position. Overexposure also invites unnecessary opinions, comparisons, and resistance from people who don't understand your path. McCorvey encourages readers to see their privacy not as a luxury, but as a tool for empowerment. When you're not constantly explaining yourself, you gain the freedom to change direction, to grow in silence, to fail without scrutiny, and to build without interference. This invisible work is often where the most authentic success is born, not in the performance of progress but in the solitude of strategy. The chapter ends by reminding the reader that influence is not a product of volume but of weight. People don't remember those who speak the most, but those whose presence lingers, whose words carry meaning, and whose actions make impact. And often, the most powerful people in the room are the ones who say the least. McCorvey closes with a clear message. If you want to build real, lasting influence, resist the urge to constantly narrate your journey. Let others talk. Let others perform. You instead focus on becoming undeniable, not through exposure but through excellence and presence. Because when everything is seen, nothing is special. And when everyone knows everything about you, they stop looking closer. So, protect your edge. Control your story. And never forget that the less they know, the more they wonder. Chapter 3: How to be Unreadable. J.J. McCorvey digs deep into the mechanics of becoming a person who cannot be easily categorized, predicted, or decoded. A concept he argues is crucial for maintaining power, privacy, and presence in a world obsessed with quick judgments and simplified identities. Being unreadable, McCorvey explains, is not about being deceptive or secretive for its own sake. Rather, it's about preserving your psychological autonomy and protecting your personal and professional moves from premature exposure, sabotage, or manipulation. He opens the chapter by illustrating how society is wired to interpret people rapidly, often through superficial cues, your job title, your social media persona, your wardrobe, your associations, and how these quick assessments lead to assumptions that can limit how others treat you, and more dangerously, how you begin to treat yourself. McCorvey insists that once people feel like they've figured you out, they stop engaging with you in meaningful ways. They pigeonhole you, project limitations onto you, and box you into a role that may no longer serve your evolution. Therefore, he argues that your power increases when you are difficult to define, not confusing but complex. not loud but layered. Becoming unreadable involves building intentional ambiguity into how you show up in the world, and McCorvey provides practical guidance for how to cultivate that ambiguity without compromising authenticity. He encourages readers to resist the temptation to over-explain themselves, especially in conversations where status, validation, or belonging are at play. For instance, instead of answering the common question, "What do you do?" with a detailed job title and mission statement, he suggests using vague, creative, or redirecting responses that either invite curiosity or gently shift the topic, such as "a bit of this and that," or "I'm focused on some interesting things right now," or even responding with a question in return. This tactic serves multiple purposes. It removes the pressure to perform, avoids revealing too much too soon, and forces others to engage with you beyond your resume. McCorvey explains that this resistance to immediate self-disclosure creates psychological friction that draws people in rather than pushing them away. In the same way that mystery heightens attraction, unreadability sustains influence by making others feel that they haven't quite gotten to the bottom of who you are. The chapter dives into the subtle art of controlling your signals: what you wear, how you speak, how you use silence, and how you respond to praise or criticism. He notes that highly readable people are often easy to manipulate because their reactions are predictable. But unreadable individuals, by contrast, maintain control of a situation by making others uncertain of where they stand, what they think, or what they'll do next. McCorvey points out that unpredictability, when used deliberately, creates leverage, whether in negotiations, relationships, or leadership. He suggests cultivating calm and measured responses even when provoked, keeping your emotions close to the chest, and choosing words carefully so that others are left wondering about your full meaning or intention. In essence, he encourages readers to speak less and mean more, allowing ambiguity to become a strategic filter. The people who truly understand your value will stay engaged, while the superficial or opportunistic will drift away. The chapter also touches on social media, warning that constant digital transparency makes you more readable, and therefore more vulnerable, to strangers, competitors, and even people in your own circle. McCorvey urges restraint in what you post, how you comment, and how much of your inner world you make public. Instead of broadcasting every goal, process, or success, he suggests developing a habit of silent wins, letting your accomplishments speak for themselves when the time is right, rather than feeding the insatiable appetite of online audiences. He emphasizes that what makes someone truly compelling is not just what they do, but what people can't figure out about them, what remains unsaid, unseen, or unshared. Being unreadable in this context becomes a protective layer against envy, projection, and sabotage, while also preserving a deeper sense of peace and focus. McCorvey also explores the internal benefits of unreadability. When you stop trying to manage how others perceive you, you reclaim mental energy and emotional clarity. You stop living for applause or approval and start living on your own terms, allowing your values and vision, not external validation, to guide your behavior. He argues that being unreadable is a form of psychological discipline, a quiet refusal to let the world script your identity. And that discipline can be deeply empowering, especially for those who feel watched, underestimated, or misunderstood. The chapter concludes by reframing unreadability not as a mask, but as a form of self-respect. It's about moving through the world with intention rather than explanation, with clarity rather than exposure. It's about choosing when, how, and if others get to access different parts of your story, and understanding that mystery isn't a lack of identity, it's a sophisticated way of protecting and amplifying it. McCorvey leaves the reader with a clear directive: don't make it easy for people to pin you down. Keep something for yourself. Let your silence raise questions. Let your presence leave gaps they can't fill. Because when people can't read you, they have no choice but to respect you, or fear you, and that tension, when handled with calm confidence, becomes the foundation of real, lasting power. Chapter 4: Guard Your Identity. J.J. McCorvey builds on the previous chapter's themes by examining the deeply personal, yet universally strategic act of protecting one's sense of self from dilution, distortion, and manipulation in a world that constantly demands definition and exposure. McCorvey begins by emphasizing that identity, our truest understanding of who we are, is one of the most valuable forms of intellectual and emotional property we possess, and just like any high-value asset, it requires boundaries, discretion, and strategic stewardship. He challenges the notion that identity should be fluidly and publicly always expressed, especially in environments that reward performance over authenticity. From career networking to online branding to everyday social interactions, the modern world pressures individuals to flatten and package their identities for quick consumption, often reducing the richness of who we are into a tagline, job title, or curated image. McCorvey argues that this relentless exposure opens the door for others to project assumptions onto us, define us prematurely, or even weaponize our story against us. Guarding your identity, he asserts, is not about secrecy or withdrawal, it's about intention. It's the disciplined refusal to let your essence become distorted by external labels, fleeting applause, or the shallow need to be seen. He highlights how dangerous it can be when you allow others to shape your narrative or when you adopt an identity based on what gets the most likes, praise, or recognition, because in doing so, you become reactive, living through the eyes of others rather than the lens of your own values. McCorvey also addresses how identity theft isn't just a financial risk, but a psychological one. When you constantly perform for the world, you lose touch with the self you no longer spend time with privately. That disconnection makes you more vulnerable to anxiety, insecurity, and manipulation, because your sense of worth becomes externally anchored. Guarding your identity is, in this way, a form of self-preservation. McCorvey encourages readers to reclaim their internal space by becoming more selective about what they share, who they allow access to their innermost goals, and how they define themselves in the face of social expectations. He introduces the concept of private certainty, the confidence that comes not from how others view you, but from how deeply you understand yourself and how little you need to explain it to others. That kind of grounded identity doesn't shift with trends, public opinion, or external validation. It allows you to move through life with a quiet power, a steady core that doesn't need to be performed to be real. McCorvey also explores the idea that when you keep key parts of your identity guarded, your motivations, your beliefs, your insecurities, you gain the freedom to evolve without having to apologize for growth. When everyone knows every part of your story, you're trapped by their memory of who you were. But when you keep parts of yourself off stage, you reserve the right to change, to pivot, to explore new dimensions of yourself without feeling like you've betrayed anyone's expectations. He likens this to a fortress. Your identity is the stronghold that must be protected from the noise of the world, not because it is weak, but because it is sacred. This sacredness doesn't mean hiding who you are. Rather, it means being strategic about which parts of yourself you reveal and in which contexts. McCorvey points out that different environments demand different versions of us, and while adaptability is important, dilution is not. Guarding your identity means refusing to compromise your values for acceptance, refusing to conform just to be liked, and refusing to overshare just to be relevant. The chapter also touches on how guarding your identity creates space for deeper, more meaningful relationships. When you don't feel the need to put everything on display, you give others the opportunity to earn your trust, to ask better questions, to connect with you on substance rather than surface. And in turn, you attract people who are more aligned with your real self, not the performance of your public persona. McCorvey discusses how leaders, creatives, and thinkers who've had the greatest impact often operated with a strong sense of identity that was shielded from public tampering. They allowed their work, presence, and principles to speak louder than their personal narratives. He encourages the reader to reflect on the boundaries they currently have, or lack, around their identity and to ask critical questions. Who gets to define me? What parts of myself am I giving away too easily? Where have I traded authenticity for applause? What would it look like to reclaim my narrative on my own terms? He asserts that identity, when guarded well, becomes a compass, quiet but firm, invisible but unwavering, capable of guiding decisions without needing external approval. And perhaps most importantly, a well-guarded identity creates psychological leverage. When others can't fully read or define you, they must approach you with more care, more curiosity, and often more respect. In this way, guarding your identity becomes not just a personal practice, but a strategic advantage. You don't become less visible, you become less predictable. You don't become less expressive, you become more intentional. McCorvey ends the chapter with a powerful call to action. In a time when everyone is busy marketing who they are, be the one who quietly protects who you are becoming. Let your values drive your visibility, not the other way around. Because when you guard your identity, you protect your potential. You make space for quiet growth, silent moves, and focused evolution. And that is where real power lives, not in the noise of exposure but in the silence of self-possession. Chapter 5, Let Them Guess. J.J. McCorvey dives deep into the powerful psychology of ambiguity, unpredictability, and mental distance, arguing that the most magnetic individuals are those who leave people slightly unsure, those who consciously choose not to fill in every blank, clarify every detail, or explain every move. At the heart of the chapter is a core idea. When you deny people full access to your intentions, routines, or inner thoughts, You invite curiosity, speculation, and ultimately intrigue, all of which can be leveraged into influence. McCorvey contends that the cultural obsession with clarity, being direct, being transparent, being real, often comes at the cost of our personal leverage. In trying to make sure everyone understands us, likes us, or approves of our path, we give away the very thing that makes us interesting: the unknown. Letting people guess is not about manipulation, it's about restraint. It's about knowing that in silence there is power, and in uncertainty, there is opportunity. He describes how the most memorable characters, whether in business, art, leadership, or everyday life, are often those who make people wonder, what are they really thinking? What are they really up to? That question mark creates a subtle tension, a gravitational pull that keeps others mentally engaged. McCorvey highlights how in a world saturated with self-promotion, oversharing, and endless opinion streaming, choosing to be a mystery is a radical act of self-respect and strategic positioning. He makes the case that when people can't easily define or predict you, they often default to overestimating you. In their mind, mystery is often equated with mastery. They assume depth where they see discretion, and they project strength where they sense silence. McCorvey explores how this effect plays out in social and professional dynamics, noting that when you're always available, always explaining, always showing your cards, people feel like they've seen the whole show, and the suspense dies. But when you let them guess, when you pull back just enough to create a vacuum, they start filling in the gaps with their own imagination, often assigning you more power, more intelligence, or more potential than you might have revealed directly. This, McCorvey argues, is how reputations are built, not by oversharing but by underexplaining. He gives examples of leaders and creatives who carefully manage how much of their process and personality they reveal, choosing to be strategically quiet rather than constantly vocal. And he stresses that their ability to let people guess is what allows them to retain authority and mystique. The idea is to stop satisfying everyone's curiosity too quickly. Let your actions imply more than your words confirm. Let your silence invite questions. Let your outcomes speak in riddles. McCorvey acknowledges that this approach can feel counterintuitive, especially in an age that praises openness and visibility, but he warns that overclarity often backfires. It leaves no room for surprise, growth, or awe. By letting people guess, you build mental real estate in their minds. They start wondering about you in quiet moments. They replay your words trying to extract deeper meaning. They anticipate your next move with heightened interest. And the best part? You're not doing more. You're simply saying less. He encourages readers to build a habit of leaving things slightly unsaid, pausing before answering, resisting the urge to correct every misconception, and walking away from conversations with just enough left behind to keep people thinking. Not because you're being evasive, but because you're choosing not to exhaust your presence by over-explaining it. The chapter also explores the deeper psychological benefits of this mindset. Letting people guess reduces the emotional labor of constantly managing perceptions. It liberates you from the need to be perfectly understood, and it allows your identity to exist outside of external approval. It also creates a buffer that protects your inner world, your motivations, your doubts, your plans, from becoming common knowledge and thus common property. McCorvey stresses that this distance isn't coldness, it's clarity. You're not pushing people away, you're training them to approach you with more intentionality. He even suggests that your unpredictability can serve as a filter. The people who are insecure or controlling will find your ambiguity uncomfortable, while those who are grounded will respect your boundaries and lean in with interest rather than entitlement. Letting them guess is about reclaiming your agency over how much others know and how soon they know it. McCorvey also emphasizes the role of timing. Sharing too soon, even if it's true, can erode your mystique. But by delaying disclosure or offering pieces of your story in nonlinear, fragmented ways, you maintain control over your narrative and pace. He uses the metaphor of a film director. The best storytellers don't reveal everything in the first scene. They build intrigue by managing what the audience sees and when. You can do the same in life. You can lead conversations with questions instead of answers. You can introduce ideas in fragments instead of full declarations. You can stay unpredictable without being erratic, quiet without being absent, and interesting without being needy. The goal is not to be unknowable but to be unpinnable, just outside the lines of certainty. McCorvey ends the chapter with a compelling reminder: the moment everyone understands you fully is the moment they stop paying attention. So don't rob yourself of your own mystique. Don't flatten your complexity for the sake of being palatable. Be the conversation they replay. Be the silence they remember. Be the question they can't quite answer. Because in the end, people don't follow those who explain themselves constantly, they follow those who leave a trail of wonder. And the most powerful sentence you can leave behind is the one you never say. So, let them guess, not because you're hiding but because you're choosing to be seen through a lens they must earn. Chapter 6: Silent Wins. J.J. McCorvey unpacks one of the most countercultural yet powerful ideas in the entire book: that the victories which shape your life the most deeply are often the ones you don't announce, advertise, or perform for others, and that real power often grows best in silence. He argues that we live in an era where nearly every achievement, intention, or even half-formed effort is shared for likes, claps, reposts, and validation, but in doing so, many people dilute the potency of their own momentum. Silent wins are the private, internal triumphs that no one sees but that reshape who you are and how you move. They are the job offers you accept without a post, the fitness milestones you hit without a photo, the emotional healing you undergo without an Instagram story, the ideas you execute without asking for permission. McCorvey explores how the need for external affirmation often corrupts the energy that accomplishment creates, because the moment you share something too early or too loudly, you invite noise, projection, envy, misunderstanding, and in some cases interference. He insists that some things gain strength only when they're protected from public exposure. When you move in silence, you eliminate distractions, preserve focus, and avoid the unnecessary friction of outside opinions. He explains that silence, when paired with intentional effort, becomes a form of discipline. It keeps you rooted in your goals instead of drifting into performance. Silent wins develop self-respect because they require you to validate yourself without applause, and McCorvey argues that this self-sourced validation is the most durable kind. He recounts stories of individuals who quietly built businesses, paid off debt, changed their body, or transformed their mindset without telling anyone until the results became undeniable, and how their silence was not secrecy out of shame, but strategy born of clarity. He emphasizes that public recognition can sometimes put pressure on progress. Once others are watching, the goal becomes not just to succeed but to succeed publicly and quickly. This pressure can suffocate creativity, distort motives, and tempt people to prioritize optics over substance. But silent wins bypass that trap. They are wins measured not by how many people see them, but by how much integrity and intention they were built with. McCorvey also notes that the most powerful people in any room are usually the ones who don't have to prove they're powerful, because real strength doesn't need noise. Silent winners don't need to compete out loud, they're too busy evolving privately. He challenges the reader to examine their own motives when sharing progress. Are you documenting it for inspiration or for validation? Are you sharing out of overflow or out of insecurity? Would the victory still feel as real if no one acknowledged it? If not, you might be chasing recognition more than real growth. McCorvey suggests cultivating a mindset where quiet progress is enough, where inner transformation doesn't require outer celebration. He also unpacks the psychological freedom that comes with silent wins. When no one knows your next move, no one can sabotage it, copy it, critique it, or prematurely celebrate it. You protect your plans by simply not giving them air until they're fully formed. In this way, silence becomes armor, not to keep the world out but to keep your process pure. The chapter encourages setting private milestones and celebrating them inwardly. Taking yourself out to dinner for a quiet win, journaling the achievement instead of broadcasting it, telling a trusted mentor instead of telling the timeline. McCorvey warns that the addiction to public acknowledgement can easily disguise itself as authenticity, but true authenticity is knowing when something is sacred enough to keep to yourself. He acknowledges the emotional discomfort this can cause. After all, we all crave to be seen, but insists that growing comfortable with being unseen, especially while you're building, is a form of spiritual maturity. Silent wins are proof that you trust the process, that you're willing to let your results speak when they're ready instead of announcing your intentions and losing steam before the work is done. He draws a distinction between intention and completion. How many people confuse declaring a goal with having achieved it? McCorvey urges the reader to reverse that habit, to normalize finishing in silence, launching without announcement, and succeeding without seeking credit. In doing so, you create a private record of success that no one can take from you, revise, or manipulate. You own your timeline and you own your story. He also highlights how silent wins protect you from jealousy and sabotage. When others don't know what you're doing, they can't compete with or undermine it. Jealousy often thrives on visibility, but when you move quietly, you sidestep unnecessary drama. He gives practical advice. Remove the impulse to update everyone, resist the need to over-explain when you're working on something new, and embrace the power of being low-key until the time is right. McCorvey closes the chapter with a powerful meditation on dignity, the quiet dignity that comes with knowing what you've survived, accomplished, and overcome, even if no one else does. He urges the reader to cultivate a private archive of success, to honor those quiet victories not with noise, but with gratitude, confidence, and more forward motion. Because in a world where everyone's shouting, sometimes the most unforgettable voice is the one you don't hear until the win is complete. Silent wins aren't just about humility, they're about holding on to your power until it becomes undeniable, unignorable, and unshakable. You don't need to say much when your results say everything. So keep moving quietly. Let your silence build pressure. Let your stillness generate strength. And when you arrive fully, without announcement, but with impact that speaks for itself. Chapter 7: Strategic Social Disengagement. J.J. McCorvey explores the powerful yet often misunderstood art of deliberately removing oneself from social environments, conversations, and relationships, not as a form of avoidance or aloofness, but as a calculated, empowering act of clarity, preservation, and control. He begins by dismantling the societal pressure to always be available, always be connected, and always be on, asserting that these expectations not only drain energy but also erode individuality. In a world where presence is mistaken for relevance and interaction is mistaken for influence, McCorvey makes the case that true personal power sometimes demands invisibility and disconnection. Strategic social disengagement is not about ghosting people or burning bridges, but about reclaiming your time, attention, and energy from environments that no longer nourish you, serve your purpose, or align with your growth. It is about stepping back not to isolate but to recalibrate, detaching from noise to rediscover your signal. McCorvey argues that in the constant swirl of conversations, group chats, social media updates, and performative gatherings, people often forget that they have the right to disappear, not out of bitterness but out of discernment. He introduces the idea that constantly being plugged in compromises your ability to observe, think independently, and operate from intuition rather than consensus. By disengaging, you break the cycle of needing to respond, explain, and react, and instead, you enter a state of internal alignment where you can make choices from clarity, not social conditioning. He reflects on how powerful figures, artists, leaders, and visionaries throughout history have always had periods of retreat, times when they pulled back from the crowd, disconnected from popular opinion, and immersed themselves in solitude to sharpen their insight, strategy, or creativity. McCorvey makes it clear that social disengagement is not about becoming antisocial or indifferent, but about setting boundaries so your identity isn't diluted by proximity to people or systems that pull you in multiple directions. He points out that many individuals are socially exhausted not because of introversion, but because they are constantly performing in rooms that demand a version of them that isn't authentic. Disengaging, then, becomes a necessary detox. It's a refusal to water yourself down just to stay socially palatable. McCorvey also explains the tactical benefit of removing yourself from environments where you're too visible, because overexposure breeds familiarity, and familiarity often breeds complacency or disrespect. When you're always accessible, people stop valuing your presence. But when you step back, you force others to reevaluate their access, their assumptions, and sometimes, their treatment of you. Silence and absence, when done with purpose, can recalibrate respect. He gives examples of how temporarily exiting certain social circles or platforms can reset your energy, your creativity, and your perspective. It's in these quiet spaces that ideas form, strategies mature, and confidence becomes self-generated rather than crowd-dependent. McCorvey touches on the emotional resistance that can come with disengagement, feelings of guilt, fear of missing out, or anxiety about being forgotten, but he insists that these emotions are rooted in a false belief that your value is tied to your visibility. Strategic disengagement reminds you that your worth is inherent, not performative. It's not measured by how many people notice you, but by how true you are to yourself when no one's watching. He encourages readers to identify the spaces, people, or digital environments where they feel drained, performative, or unseen, and to begin setting quiet, firm boundaries. Maybe that means stepping back from certain social circles, muting digital noise, declining invitations, or simply not explaining your absence. He emphasizes that disengagement is most powerful when it's intentional and unapologetic, not out of drama or bitterness, but from a place of knowing what deserves your presence and what no longer does. McCorvey also highlights the creative advantage of social retreat. When you're not constantly reacting to what others are doing or saying, your mind becomes fertile ground for original thought. You stop comparing your path to others. You start hearing your own voice again. He urges readers to make disengagement a regular practice, not just a last resort during burnout, but a proactive strategy for maintaining mental clarity, emotional sovereignty, and energetic control. Disengagement also gives you the ability to observe dynamics without being entangled in them. You begin to see patterns, motivations, and games that were previously invisible when you were immersed. In this way, withdrawal becomes wisdom. You don't have to say everything you see or react to every shift, you just watch, understand, and move accordingly. McCorvey reminds the reader that sometimes, the most powerful move is no move at all. The most powerful voice is the one that knows when to go quiet. The most strategic act is the decision not to engage in battles that do not serve your peace. He finishes the chapter by reinforcing that you do not owe the world your constant commentary, your presence at every event, or your participation in every conversation. Strategic disengagement is not failure to connect. It's the discipline to protect your essence. It's about knowing when to pause, when to pull back, and when to disappear, so that you can re-enter not with noise, but with new strength, clearer vision, and grounded power. In a time when everyone is addicted to being seen, be the person who masters the art of retreat. Step back to rise. Disengage to realign. Be present but not consumed. Socially aware but not socially dependent. Because the more you disconnect from what doesn't matter, the more deeply you reconnect to what does. Chapter 8: Reputation Through Action. J.J. McCorvey delivers a compelling examination of how true influence, authority, and respect are built not through declarations, branding, or image maintenance, but through the consistent execution of action, deliberate, visible, and results-driven behavior that speaks louder than any biography, social media profile, or verbal claim ever could. He begins by confronting a common misconception in the modern world: that reputation is something you talk your way into, something you curate through clever storytelling or content creation, rather than something you earn through what you repeatedly do when no one's clapping. McCorvey dismantles the performative culture where people confuse announcements with impact and instead redirects the reader's focus to the idea that reputation is not something you say, it's what others conclude about you based on patterns of behavior they can't deny. He emphasizes that actions leave an undeniable residue in people's minds. They remember how you showed up when it mattered, how you handled pressure, how you moved when no one was watching, and whether your results matched your rhetoric. In this way, your reputation becomes your living resume, constantly being written and edited by the things you do, not the things you say you will do. McCorvey explains that people might be temporarily impressed by charisma or claims, but what they really respect, what earns trust and long-term credibility, is performance, delivery, follow-through. He draws a sharp line between those who want a reputation and those who deserve one, arguing that the latter do not chase perception, they focus on production. Their work builds their story and their story builds itself. He explores how too many people waste energy on trying to control what others think instead of making their actions so consistent, so undeniable, that perception naturally aligns with reality. McCorvey insists that your reputation should be a byproduct of who you are under pressure, how you treat people when there's nothing to gain, and what gets done when you're not being supervised. When you start thinking this way, the need to explain yourself diminishes. You no longer need to correct every rumor or respond to every assumption because your work, your consistent, grounded, unshakable work, becomes the loudest voice in the room. He encourages readers to use their actions as silent proof, to focus less on projecting confidence and more on producing excellence. A real reputation doesn't beg for attention, it earns presence. It walks in before you speak. McCorvey also reminds the reader that reputations take time to build and seconds to destroy, not because of one mistake but because of inconsistency. People trust what's predictable, and the fastest way to weaken your influence is to constantly act out of alignment with your claimed values. If you want to be known as reliable, then show up early and finish strong, consistently. If you want to be known as brilliant, then solve problems and innovate without waiting for praise. If you want to be respected, then deliver value with humility, not ego. Reputation, McCorvey argues, is a result of accumulated behaviors, not occasional performances. He shares stories of quiet professionals, leaders, and creatives who never asked to be admired, but simply did the work so relentlessly well that others had no choice but to take notice. They didn't spend time defending themselves, they spent time becoming undeniable. McCorvey points out that in a world addicted to attention, being respected has more value than being noticed. He urges readers to stop chasing quick validation and start building something long-lasting, a character-driven reputation based on effort, ethic, and execution. He dives into the psychology behind this, explaining that humans are wired to remember consistency over charisma. A person who quietly delivers results over time will outlast and outperform the loudest voice in the room. He emphasizes the need to think long-term. Short-term noise might get applause, but it fades quickly. Long-term action builds legacy. He also warns against the temptation to try to correct your reputation with words. If you feel misunderstood, don't explain harder, Act clearer. Let time and behavior do the explaining for you. Reputation is like a bank account. It compounds through deposits of discipline, and it's safeguarded through discretion. McCorvey introduces the idea that every action is either reinforcing or weakening your reputation, and if you're serious about influence, you need to be meticulous about alignment between what you say, what you do, and how you deliver. He suggests that people should ask themselves not what do I want to be known for, but what do my actions consistently show? Because the truth of one's reputation lives in that answer. And while you can't fully control what people say about you, you can control what you consistently demonstrate. That consistency becomes your shield. McCorvey closes the chapter with a challenge. Instead of promoting yourself, build a track record so strong it doesn't need translation. Be so consistent that even your silence feels powerful. Build your name not by telling people what you are, but by showing them through what you do, again and again. In the end, people don't remember the pitch, they remember the product. They remember the impact. They remember the results. Let your actions narrate your story so that when people describe you, they don't say what you told them, they say what they saw. Conclusion. In the conclusion of Never Tell People What You Do, J.J. McCorvey ties together the core philosophy that has underpinned the entire book. A philosophy rooted not in arrogance or secrecy, but in power, restraint, intentionality, and self-preservation. He emphasizes that the ultimate form of influence doesn't come from constant self-promotion or overexposure, but from a quiet, confident presence that communicates everything without having to say anything. By the end of the book, McCorvey makes it clear that we live in an age obsessed with visibility, where worth is falsely tied to how often you're seen, heard, validated, or shared. Yet he argues that the most impactful, legendary, and effective people have learned how to operate with precision behind the scenes, letting their results, reputation, and restraint do the talking. Never tell people what you do becomes a mantra not of isolation but of quiet mastery. It's about creating a presence that invites curiosity, commands respect, and cultivates strength through the art of mystery, consistency, and intention. McCorvey reflects on how modern culture pressures individuals to constantly explain themselves, to update the world on their goals, their moves, their relationships, their mindset shifts, and even their healing. But in doing so, people often rob themselves of the sacred power of privacy, overextend their emotional energy, and allow others to poke holes in plans that aren't yet solidified. The conclusion urges readers to reverse this trend by becoming deeply comfortable with being misunderstood, underestimated, or simply unseen, because being visible to everyone isn't a measure of success, being aligned with yourself is. McCorvey reiterates that influence is not about being the loudest voice in the room, but about being the most grounded one. He challenges the reader to remember that some of the most life-changing work happens offstage, in silence, away from the applause. The work you do in private, when no one is watching, posting, or applauding, is the work that truly defines you. This includes the healing you do from childhood trauma, the discipline you build when no one's cheering, the boundaries you enforce even when they go unnoticed, and the plans you execute with quiet confidence. McCorvey encourages the reader to live in such a way that your success becomes inevitable, undeniable, and unexplainable, not because you shouted it but because you walked in it. He touches again on the value of unpredictability, explaining that when people can't read your every move, they can't control, manipulate, or mirror you. Discretion becomes your armor. Privacy becomes your power. He warns against oversharing your dreams, explaining that some dreams lose power the moment they're exposed to premature commentary or casual spectators. Instead, protect your vision like a seed, plant it in silence, water it with discipline, and let it grow strong enough to speak for itself through results. The conclusion also highlights the importance of preserving your energy and refusing to perform. McCorvey notes that constantly feeling the need to prove, explain, or showcase what you're doing is a trap that keeps you externally focused and emotionally scattered. He asserts that internal power is developed through silence, solitude, and self-trust, not through performance. When you stop announcing your moves, you reduce pressure, remove distractions, and protect your momentum. McCorvey reaffirms that real power doesn't move with noise, it moves with intention. People who are truly in their zone don't need to convince you of their relevance. You feel it. You see it in how they carry themselves, how they move with clarity, how they don't flinch in the face of misunderstanding or silence. He encourages the reader to develop such strong internal alignment that external opinions become background noise. You don't need to correct, announce, or defend what you do, because what you do will become so clear through your presence, your results, and your peace that words become unnecessary. The conclusion also offers a reminder. Walking in silence doesn't mean walking in loneliness. It means choosing your audience wisely. McCorvey is not advocating for isolation or emotional detachment. He's advocating for discernment, for knowing when to speak, when to listen, and when to let the silence work on your behalf. Share with those who earn the right to witness your journey, not with those who scroll through your life with idle curiosity. He urges you to embrace the depth that comes from choosing quality over quantity, precision over performance, and impact over applause. Ultimately, McCorvey closes with a powerful invitation. Live a life so full, so grounded, so quietly confident that you never feel the need to prove your worth through words. Let your presence carry weight. Let your results tell your story. Let your stillness speak volumes. He reminds you that mastery doesn't announce itself. True growth doesn't need to post proof. And people with real power know how to disappear and still be felt. The essence of never tell people what you do is not about being secretive, it's about being intentional. It's about trusting your journey enough to walk it quietly, owning your space without seeking applause, and letting the substance of your work create echoes louder than any self-description ever could. In a culture of constant noise, the person who knows when to stay silent, when to move in the dark, and when to let their results speak, will always be the one who stands out the most. Because in the end, power is not just what you say, it's what you don't have to say. That is the mark of someone who doesn't just do the work but becomes the work. And when you become the work, your silence becomes undeniable proof.